we will move on and develop into the general discussion, which I will start, and then we come back. All those who wanted to talk will be written down. But opening, I wish to touch two concepts that emerged this morning. One is this Kuhnian issue. On one hand, Dr. Perlmutter says this is no revolution, this is normal science working. We have breast cancer, then we subdivide patients by receptors and so forth. It's normal science working well. And then from Dr. Hood, we really hear, by reading Kuhn, what could qualify as a paradigm shift. First, he pointed out to a crisis in the system, showing the number needed to treat problem that we cannot go over through, that we are stuck in prevention, the plateau of clinical medicine, and there he introduces new concepts. It's another Kuhnian criterion for paradigm, like wellness, brain health, coaches in health, and at the heart of it is the whole idea, if I got it right, you collect lots of data and you give lots of advice and you may skip the whole metaphysics of disease in between, just the heuristics. But then things get more complicated because inside the so there's like personalized medicine, the traditional way, we just refine a little bit the groups or stratify, and there is the more ambitious way, the radical utopian way that we collect data and process it and get advice and we are well. But in it, I find two lines that are low-tech and high-tech, and I wish to try to understand better. The low-tech is what we hear about coaches, personal coaches. That in a way reminds us of the barefoot doctors following the Maoistic revolution and the partners of health, and you get personal coaches that help you comply with healthcare advice, and that might work miraculously with our ordinary patients and ordinary knowledge. Nobody has tested this. And there's the high tech, that we need this lots of data processed and genomics and omics. And with the vision of P4, they are both like mixed up. We wish to know whether the coach system, whether money is on the coaching, personal coaching, and not with high-tech knowledge, or the high-tech knowledge counts even if we don't get coaching, we just get a message, or we need a combination. So this is one thing I'd like to hear more. And then we have the issue that one of the new concepts is brain health or wellness. And the brain is particularly, as we've seen from Professor Fins, it is part of the body, so it's always what we know about the brain, and it could be amyloid plaques, etc., but it's also reactive to the body, how we think, how we feel, and many people keep very sharp and lively brains despite sick bodies, and vice versa. And this moves on to what Jenny touched, what the person on the street can see. And it's just not whether the person on the street can see whether I'm conscious or not or whatever. It goes also to the key revolution of brain death. That death is something certainly a person on the street could see. Until 1911, there was no duty by law anywhere for a doctor to confirm that a person was dead. The coroner needed to be a doctor. And then we have all this distance between what people perceive about wellness, about brain death, and how we have the answers. And this is the last point here I wish to hear, and we got it beautifully through the discussion following Dr. Legato. When it comes to sexuality, there's a typical human phenomena, but there is a gap between what there is and where we are going at, whether it's to find a mate or to have or not to have a child or so forth. And what is brain health or wellness? Because for certain computers might tell you that it's not that healthy for a woman to be pregnant, or it might tell you that for certain people it might be in the line to be gay or to be a woman, and we start losing who is telling who why, because wellness is also health, at least, and a spiritual dimension by the World Health Organization, something we have to aspire for, and not necessarily something we get directions of implementing. And by these few comments that I got from your talks, we'll go back to the discussion before lunch with trying to better integration of the things that have come up here.
We have Professor Prensak, Professor Ciechanover, and Dr. Lander.
Interesting morning, and thank you, Yechiel, for your summary and for asking these questions. I hope you will forgive me if I say I'm not interested in whether this is a paradigm shift or not, because in a way we know the answer. Programmatically it is, and empirically yes. Okay, I'll repeat what I said. I think programmatically there are lots of people who want this to be a paradigm shift and a revolution, as also the title of this meeting suggests. Empirically, I think what Professor Muazzam said is the key to the answer. It depends. It depends. For some people, this is totally far removed, and for others, we have already reached a very, very deep level of granular stratification. But what I am interested in is, I think the way we phrase the question and frame the questions is very important, and we shouldn't make the mistake of creating or thinking in terms of dichotomies that we then shoot down. So for example, whereas I agree with your skepticism, Donna, of the personalization imperative, very much. I don't think personalization and stratification are opposite, are in a dichotomic relationship at all. I think stratification uses categories and is relatively coarse, whereas ideas of individualization with all the caveats that we have with regard to what that presupposes in terms of the individual being the ordering principle of the world. But that is a very, very granular level of stratification. So I think stratification is a scale, and the question that Joseph mentioned in his talk is the key question. Who decides what categories we use? Who decides what categories are relevant, and for what end? And we haven't talked about the end yet, for what ends. And the same goes, and then I'm done, for low-tech and high-tech. I don't think that these are opposites at all. So I think Lee showed us examples of where low-tech interventions, if we consider video conferencing as a low-tech intervention, but it's low-tech on the basis of high-tech data, although I think you only offer, you have a route where you offer only the coaching without the analysis. But still, I think low-tech here is to facilitate high-tech sort of data interpretation and data collection, of course. On the other hand, we have a lot of high-tech solutions, such as smart glasses that enable low-tech, hence, you know, your high-touch medicine, where physicians shouldn't be forced to look into the screens all the time, but they can look at patients again. So I think it's not a very fruitful way of thinking of stratification and individualization as opposites, or low-tech and high-tech.
I have a question to Lihud about your 108 group. Actually, the question is whether you have a control group. Now, why am I asking it? I'm asking it because of a bioethical issue, but also most because of a biological issue. The bioethical one is whether it's moral to have a control group. Once you know that the perfect treatment that you are giving to your 108, correcting all the laboratory examination, asking them to run a marathon a day, to climb the Everest once a week, whatever, will certainly have an advantage. But the second issue has to do with biology, and that's also important. How much living perfect life will really extend our healthy life? How much you expect to be unexpected, you know, a tumor that will not be detected, biomarkers that are not there, brain bleeding that cannot be expected, and so on. So I think that it's very important to have a comparison group. They'll tell you what is the benefit of living such life. I don't doubt that there is a benefit, but still I want to quantify it.
I think that's a very good point. And what I would, again, indicate is that we do have a wonderful clinical trial going on at Providence St. Joseph's with 1,000 employees who are enrolled in the Airveil program for a 3-year period, compared against 1,000 random employees that are not undergoing such treatment. And this will go on for a 3-year period, and 2 questions will be of interest. What is the difference in wellness? And we can measure that a number of different ways, biochemically and everything. And what are the kind of cost savings that would come as a result of these things? So we're a year into this clinical trial now, and, you know, I'll say the results look really quite promising, but we're going to wait until we get to that 3-year period before we draw conclusions. But I think having a control group is absolutely essential. No.
Can I ask you, is that a randomly assigned control group? Do they get randomly assigned to be in Airveil or not?
So the answer is, to a first approximation, yes. They chose 2,000 employees and then shuffled them into different groups. And I say approximately because there was a modest fee that each of the patients had to pay, and that did perturb the random thing. But we started out with random assignments. You know, I'd like to make one other point about this really important issue of stratification as opposed to is personalized medicine unique to the individual. I think a really good way to look at it is the stratification of the human race is really a genealogic tree. So at the very ends of the twig might be 2 identical twins, which might have only 10 or 20 mutations that arose in vitro that differentiate them, all the way up to humans that are extremely different. And you can draw your stratification points at many, many different points up the tree. And I think the really key point for where you draw them is what works. I think you do an empirical analysis, and I think you move as far up that tree as you can, because obviously we don't want to have a different treatment for each and every individual, and we won't need to for most diseases. But I think most complex diseases will stratify well beyond anything we've imagined now. With regard to the requirements, you'll need different kinds of treatments. And let me say something about wellness coaches. The wellness coaches in our programs are extremely sophisticated individuals that are using the distillation of the data, converting it into actionable possibilities, and bringing those to the coaches. And I think this is just what the healthcare system is going to need if they're going to most effectively take advantage of what the quantitative measurements of scientific wellness can actually bring to the individuals and so forth.
So I'm not a philosopher. I'm just a human geneticist. And maybe because I'm a human geneticist, I think I'm a lot more modest about what is going to come out of this than most of you are. So let me just give you some of the reasons for my modesty about what's going to happen. My colleagues at the Broad Institute were interested in the genetic factors that influence schizophrenia. We looked at 10,000 people with 6 million genetic markers, found 0 significant loci. Now, as time went on and we increased the sample size to about 150,000 people in the study, 150,000, we found 250 loci. They're interesting, they begin to point to some pathways, and they explain still a small minority of the genetics. Now, I'm an optimist. I think 250 loci will teach us about pathways, and it will be valuable. It's pointing potentially to druggable pathways. So don't get me wrong. But the idea that we are going to explain all of that variation is a pipe dream. When we look at the sample sizes needed to do almost anything, and the importance of randomization to truly learn something, I think of the hormone replacement therapy, where for a long time we thought that hormone replacement therapy was protective, but it was because it was a correlational observation in the population. And when a true randomized trial was run, it turned out to be harmful. But it took very big numbers and a specifically designed study to find that out. I don't see how small studies that are not randomized, where you have 6,000 patients or 10,000 patients or 20,000 patients, and you have 10 million genetic variables, and you have thousands and thousands of clinical observations, are going to be able to deconvolute fully. That's not to say we're not going to learn things. We'll learn things, I don't doubt it. But the potential for extraordinary false positives emerging from this, and clinics that have an interest in being able to sell their results on this, mean we are going to have real modesty about what we learn that is going to have to be imposed. Not because this stuff doesn't matter, not because it's not powerful, but because it's hard. Maybe I will end with a specific genetic study that's not been published yet, but maybe will turn into interesting discussion over lunch. Some of my colleagues have looked at the UK Biobank, which has 500,000 people, with regard to sexuality. There are questions that bear on, depending on how you define it, I will use the term non-heterosexual behavior, which is the term they will use in the paper that will appear in a couple of months. In the 500,000 people, and confirmed in subsequent studies with 23andMe, there are a handful of genetic loci that are unambiguously statistically significant that increase the probability that an individual will display non-heterosexual behavior. They are interesting, and they account for a minuscule fraction of the overall variance. But I put to you, how is that going to get digested? I've known about this for 7-8 months because the authors have been very careful, and I've been consulting this paper to help the authors think through how do they even write this so it does not get picked up and used for one political purpose or another. The political purpose that, this is genetic, or that it doesn't really explain most of it. So to me, the challenge is in the complexity and the inherent incompleteness of the knowledge we're going to have. This is where we are with 500,000 people. I can assure you, if we got 7 billion people, which maxes out on the number of people we're going to get, we still aren't going to really get there. We would need many more people than exist for the genetics to do this. So I'm curious, I just mean to stir up trouble here, that we imagine a world where the answers are going to be had when we arrive over the hill, or maybe 2 or 3 hills from now. But we're going to be in a world that has continued uncertainty about this, and we've got to think about living in that world.
Professor Boniolo, Dr. Cohen, and Monsignor Sorondo.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to Eric Lander, because I had the fear to be the only one with a modest approach to the problem, but we are at least 2. Just 3 comments. The first is, we should, I think, give up with the use of Kuhnian terms, that is paradigm and revolution, because Kuhn, when he wrote his book about the structure of scientific revolution, had in mind physics and astronomy. And physics and astronomy has a totally different history concerning medicine, related to medicine. I want to show you an example. Now, we are not living in a general relativistic world, or in a special relativistic world. We are living in a totally Newtonian world. That is, we go to the moon by means of Newtonian celestic mechanics. But I can tell you something more. That is, when we sail, we use the sky of the fixed star, that is a Ptolemaic star. We use special relativity only when we use the computer, the iPhone, in order to understand where we are. And we use quantum mechanics, especially in medicine, when you do imaging, molecular imaging, that is nuclear magnetic resonance, but nothing else. So instead, we do not live in a way in which we use the same medicine of Harvey or the same medicine of Galen. It is totally different what is happening in the field of medicine compared to what's happening in the field of physics. So we should stop thinking in terms of revolution, paradigm, and normal science, so, because it doesn't work. It's a totally different matter, because medicine is a totally different matter. There is a second point, and I use Joseph's statement. And he said that there is a transition between what it is observed and what it is understood. But it is something that has always happened in the history of science. When Galilei did his discovery concerning the falling of the body, first he observed it and then tried to understand. And the same with Harvey, the same with Fabrizio d'Acquapendente, with the Ptolemaic. So it is pretty common. So there is another problem that probably disentangle this idea that we are doing something special concerning the whole history of science. And I use the same always the statement by Joseph. He said that here scientific advance present us with a paradox. New knowledge can lead to an increased uncertainty and be disempowering. But it always sucks, something like this. That is, when you have discovered the wheel, or the fire, I discovered the fire, something special. I have no more the power on the nature because the fire can do something that I cannot do. So we shouldn't be so amazed by what is going on in medicine, in personalized, stratified, precision medicine, because it is something that has always happened over the history of science. But we shouldn't do the mistake to confuse what is happening in medicine and the history of medicine, what is happening in chemistry, in physics, in astronomy, and what is happening in the history of chemistry, in the history of physics, in the history of astronomy. That is, if there is a specificity, it's not a specificity concerning genomics, post-genomics, and so on. And many times we had run the risk in bioethics to think that there is a specificity concerning the ethical issues in genomics and post-genomics, but it is wrong. The only specificity is that medicine is something special considering the other science, not because it is special in absolute, because it is different.
So the moderator focused on wellness. I'll ask a question, one of the many questions that Lee Hood, your talk raised for me about wellness. But before that, just one remark. I think it's interesting that what is happening in medicine with focusing on wellness after such a long history of focusing on disease has a parallel in psychology, where psychology, since it was born, was focused on neuroticism, and now there's a change into for more than a generation into positive psychology that focuses at last on happiness, and I think the focus on wellness is parallel to this, and it's a very good shift. My little question is about the biological age. So I understand that the biological age is a certain combined measure of many parameters, and my lack of understanding is about how you assign a biological age to each parameter. Surely you cannot do that by checking on average how this parameter manifests itself according to chronological age, because that is what you want to set it against.
So the biological age that we've defined uses the 1,200 analytes present in the blood, and the calculation comes from the fact if you look at individuals in decades of 10 years, from 20 to 30 up to 80 to 90, what you see is a linear progressive loss in the regulation of control of gene expression with increasing error bars as you get out there. So the 1,200 analytes that we're looking at probably sample hundreds of different biological systems throughout the body. So it is an averaging kind of factor. But what I will say, the biological age that we come up with, I think its validity can be only determined in the context of, does it make sense in terms of what we've observed in this large population? And as I pointed out, diabetes and pre-cardiovascular disease, people have significantly elevated biological ages above chronologic age, and people in apparently better health below have reduced ages. And again, when we measured the individuals across up to 4 years of experience in Airvale, seeing those that had very high biological ages come down a year, in a very crude approximation, I think is interesting. Now, what's really clear is there are probably 2 or 3 other major quantified methods that have been used to calculate biological age. One at UCLA using epigenetics and so forth. And we're just beginning the comparison of those studies against ours in the populations that we have. So we'll be able to compare different measures. But what I could say now is it's extremely crude measure of wellness, which I think in the future is going to turn out for the individual to be a really good index of how well are you aging in effect. Now, I want to say one more word before I give the podium up about what Eric said. So I agree entirely with Eric. Biological complexity at its heart isn't going to be soluble in our lifetime. But the really important question is, with people and with data, you can begin to formulate very carefully questions that you can define features for that are useful for health. And I'll give you a simple example again, the one I talked about with hemochromatosis. We looked at 6,000 individuals. We saw 9 that were homozygous. We saw roughly 50 that were heterozygous. And we observed that both of those types, and this is a classic Mendelian recessive disease, supposedly you need both alleles before you get it. We saw 9 out of 50, roughly, individuals that were heterozygote, that had the disease as could be defined by some early features and by high transferrin levels and so forth. So that's an example of something that's useful, and it's really useful clinically. And I'll say, depending on the question you ask, you can get valid information in an N of 1 experiment. Where you can really get incredible information is in family experiments. We've done spectacular things there. And you can get useful information in N of 6,000, and you can go to 150,000 and not find. So it depends on the question. So what you have to be able to do is give up early if it looks hopeless.
I agreed with everything except that. Because the schizophrenia example I gave you, where there was 10,000 people and no results,
Yeah.
the study section at the NIH said you should give up because there are no results. But it turned out...
I amend my last statement.
Thank you. Actually, withdrawn. Excellent.
I had the same experience with the automated DNA sequence. Of course. They absolutely said this is impossible.
I want to ask to Professor Finch about the question of consciousness and the brain. injury, especially for the question of transplants, because we have here an academician from Delmonico that is a very famous as doctor of transplant. And he is very in favor of the Maastricht 3. I don't know if you know this criterion of death, that we, in the end, when we have some kind of injury in the brain, they take the tube in the end. And I think this criteria is in some sense opposite of your approach. And the approach of the revolutionary personal medicine that try to obtain some kind of consciousness in the brain in this moment.
So I think this is a great question, and it responds to Giovanni's comment. And one of the things about medicine, which is different than physics, is the need to act, either for a patient who is sick or another patient who may need an organ, and you have a brain-dead patient, and you have to make a decision about what to do. So the criteria that's generally used is from the Harvard 1968 brain death criteria, where somebody, based on their clinical exam, their history, and you exclude the confounders like hypothermia, like a drowning victim, can have a false positive brain death test, or drugs like a barbiturate or fentanyl or an opioid or something. Go through all that. You have a sort of Bayesian predicate to think this person could be brain dead based on your clinical exam. Then you do the apnea test, where you take them off the ventilator, you let the carbon dioxide go up 20 millimeters of mercury. There's a point to my story, and there's a theological example here. And the patient, before you do this, they look pink, they have a heartbeat, they look like they're alive, okay? If you look at their brain scan, they have what's called the empty vault. So the brain is black, there's nothing going on inside the brain, but the skull is perfused. So we had a case, and I've written about this, of a patient who was declared brain dead by the criteria PCO2 goes up, the person doesn't breathe, which shows death of the brainstem, because the distinction between brain death and the vegetative state centers on the brainstem. So this person has whole brain death, and we're about to declare her. The pulmonologist who did the blood gases that show the carbon dioxide went up is there, and he had done all the calculations, and then all of a sudden the patient exhibited, and I say this with great respect in this place, the Lazarus response, the Lazarus reflex, and the patient goes like this, as if to pray. The pulmonologist who just used modern science to declare the person brain dead reaches into his pocket to grab his stethoscope to listen to the lungs that he had already determined were not working because the carbon dioxide went up. But he didn't believe what he observed because he didn't understand what had just happened, which is my quote in your response to it. And what that was a cervical reflex. It was not higher brain function. So I think the challenge with brain death, in counter to the other brain states I'm talking about, the minimally conscious state patient at the bedside looks worse than their scan. The brain dead patient looks better at the bedside than their scan. But personally, I believe if a person is adequately assessed for brain death, they can be candidates for transplant, for harvesting. The challenge is, and this goes back to the brain death criteria of 1968, where Pope Pius is actually cited in that criteria. It is a 50-year-old criteria. And the methods of assessment are probably inaccurate at the margins. And so people are now beginning to think about SPECT scans as another way to assess. But one of the other challenges is in Israel, because of the conservative, the Orthodox Jewish population, they're now using angiography in addition to the apnea test, and they're finding a 13% false positive exam on with this additional test. So I think brain death testing has to be done adequately by people who are properly trained with the use of ancillary tests when it makes sense. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
If very short comment. The quotation of Pope Pius XII is misquotation. There are many other problems with the brain death paper and procedure we could discuss at lunch, but it's a false quotation. It's not what he said that attributed to him.
In any case, it is necessary to say that the Maastricht 3 criteria are related with heart-beating death criterion and not brain death criterion. Is the attempt of harvesting organs with the criterion or heart-beating death, which are completely different from the brain death criterion.
We have Professor Wilson, Dr. Perlmutter, and Professor Erdon.
Thanks. One thing that we haven't talked about so far in the meeting is the question of health equity, so that we had a lot of examples how for the patients who are already going to do quite well, people who are motivated, able to seek lifestyle coaching, comply with that, maybe that we can get fantastic results with personalized medicine. But I was thinking that from all the surveys we have that suggest that compliance with long-term care medication is really quite poor, that the World Health Organization reckons is about 50%. And so that at the moment, even with sort of less complicated regimens, it seems that a lot of patients are not complying with them, and often those are the very patients who are going to get poor results, and often they're people who are, are going to be poorer and more vulnerable in various sorts of ways. I was wondering, is there something additional that personalized medicine will be able to offer those kinds of vulnerable patients, or is it very likely that it will just further exacerbate health inequalities?
Is it me? Okay, sorry.
So if I could go to a somewhat higher altitude, what I would say is that when we began talking, we tried to outline in a way the role of the physician, and Diego did this from a nosology perspective, because the reality is that physicians intended to treat sick people and try and make them somewhat better. And where we went very rapidly was to the question of kind of what's sick, because at least early on you could recognize a sick person pretty easily because they were in extremis, they were dying, they had some very severe thing wrong with them. And I think it was Alex Leaf who pointed out many years ago that we had reached a remarkable place in modern medicine where the average patient with an average complaint, seeing an average physician, had about a 50-50 chance of benefiting from the experience. What we're asking now, though, is for physicians to see people who fundamentally are healthy. They're well, but maybe not well enough. And that's the quantitative wellness that Lee describes. If there's a paradigm shift, and I hate to get into that again, it is the shift in looking at otherwise normal people, because the prior benefit of medicine was that patients arrived with a chief complaint. And a large part of what physicians had to do was sort out that chief complaint. And talking to patients was the most important part. Taking a history is the most important part of any physical exam, any clinical exam. So we're now in a very different place where we say, let's try and influence what happens if we treat normal people. And understandably, that kind of exercise is fraught. So what we try and do is acquire as much data as possible, because there isn't a big phenotype available to study. There's nothing seemingly wrong with those individuals. And I would point out that the data that we acquired, to Eric's point, is data, and Lee's as well, is data that is hypothesis generating. This is not hypothesis testing. The testing of that hypothesis goes back now to generations of statistical approaches that require randomization, careful control of type 1 error, in order to be sure that we're not fooled by correlations, which we generally are. Most often when we go in and test these hypotheses clinically and do adequately sized and well-controlled studies, they don't work. Examples would be, of course, the correlations with accumulation of amyloid degradation products and dementia. You can actually go in and influence the accumulation of those products, either by getting rid of them using antibodies or preventing their generation, and it doesn't do anything. In fact, it's actually harmful. So that hypothesis was tested and has been tested now repeatedly, and it was important to do those tests. It was not wrong-headed to do those tests, but unfortunately, as typically happens, we didn't get the answer that we hoped. And that's true for everyone who's been involved in these studies. The usual answer is that the complexity of the biological system is much, much greater than we appreciate. We extract a correlation, which permits us to test the hypothesis, and then we find out that we've misunderstood the underlying biology. And that process is what we're trying to get at through this scientific wellness examination, because of the fact that we're looking at very small effects, and we require a lot of data in order to get at them. And the last thing I will say, referring back to Sir William Osler, is that I have a copy of Osler's textbook of medicine, the original one. He's the only author of the textbook of medicine, a single author textbook of medicine, quite remarkable. And in that textbook of medicine, when I read it years and years ago, I stumbled on the fact that he says, of the 10,000 patients with typhoid fever whom I've personally treated, and then went on to recite what happened. And I thought, 10,000 patients, this is just a fraction of the total number of patients he saw. How could this be? But keep in mind that for those 10,000 patients, there wasn't anything he could do, right? He could simply note that, well, they might have a pulse deficit, a characteristic of typhoid fever, that despite the magnitude of the fever, the pulse was steady and at relatively normal rate, those kinds of, and then he would walk on to the next patient. So these were observations that he could make, but there was no means of intervening. Fundamentally, though, medicine has a utilitarian aspect. We hope actually to intervene to treat something and make it better. And so the goal is, how much data do we need, and what kind of data do we need in order to be able to actually implement those utilitarian practices?
I want to go back. I think Eric's provocation at the beginning, of course, is terribly important, because I think the paradox always with genomics was, is it everything or nothing? Either we have the secret of life, or we have 0 cases that go, and I think there's something really important here in our gathering, because I think in order to address that paradox, we need the group of people in this room. Because I think something that is definitely happening is that genomics, what it will do, is that it is intervening on fundamental questions, like what is sex, what is gender, what categories do we use, what are our ultimate goals and ends, what does it mean to know? All of those things, genomics is, I think, going to affect and is already doing that. Whether or not it should is another question. I mean, I would actually raise the question whether or not genomics is properly a biological discipline. If we take up Leroy Hood's argument, the move of the engineering imperative into the life sciences, there are those who would argue that that is not a science any longer, a biological science, because it is about, it takes engineering and puts it into to the center of biology, and it raises questions about whether or not we can know, which is different from the question of doing, although they are related. And this point about, Joseph, you made about medicine, we must act. And I think that's the fundamental issue we are faced with here, is how we should act. And so I think there are really fundamental questions that will affect big things about who gets to proclaim who's dead or not, or who gets to proclaim whether or not you're a member of a sex or not a member of sex, what we think about the fundamental issues of marriage and whether or not it should be between a male or female, going back to the Catholic Church interest in birth control back in the 1960s. I think genomics does weigh in on those issues, and so it's fundamentally an issue that won't be decided by scientists alone, but requires a group like this. So that would be my answer to how it matters and how you get between the paradox of it's either everything or nothing.
If you agree, I would give one more round of questions or commentaries, but I would ask them to be very short. I have from Brown, Dr. Moazzam, Barbara, you wanted, and Lander.
I would actually like to press us to discuss a bit more what James Wilson already mentioned, but we haven't commented on your question regarding equity. I would suspect that personalized medicine, precision medicine might increase efficiency in healthcare. We learn more, taking the humble approach which Eric Lander mentioned, and so on that front, I personally would be optimistic, more efficiency. But how will it play out in rather unequal systems, like take the US system, or not to mention the Indian public health system? How will it play out? Maybe some of you have thought about that. I've recently read a review on personalized medicine in Southeast Asia, so Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, and so on. Talk is there, investment is forthcoming, but reality is far from being inside what it means for patients. So that equity efficiency balance, maybe also Leroy, from your data, how will it play out in the US in terms of equity?
The initial studies we've done have been almost entirely Caucasian middle class, upper middle class individuals, because we required from each individual a payment to help defray the costs of the assays. So that is an issue that, as I indicated in my talk, I think is going to change very dramatically in the next 5 to 10 years. I think the assay cost, to give you an example, the cost of DNA sequencing from 2003 to today went down 1 million-fold. And I think we're going to see assay costs and these other kinds of things go down in not a similar fashion, but go down very, very strikingly. I think the other thing that's going to happen is if clinical trials like the one we're running are successful, I think we'll get payers to pay for it. So that, again, is going to produce a bit of equity. But right now, quite frankly, you have to be middle class to afford this kind of help and so forth. But in 10 years, I think everybody will have access to it. The real issue is different strata of populations have very different views toward health and their expectations about wellness and things like that. I mean, so you get to a question of how are we going to educate people as to these kinds of opportunities? And we're actually putting together a whole series of modules for a year-long high school course in Seattle on basically 21st century medicine, where we have modules that represent major points of view. We did this for systems biology about 10 years ago, and we made the 4 modules that we created to explain what systems biology was easily transportable, and now we can say those modules have been used in every state in the Union and in more than 100 different countries, and about 2.5 million students have worked through those kind of things. So I think these things can have a remarkable impact on education, and I think Education is going to be one of the big challenges we'll face in all countries as to making citizens at least familiar with what options are.
Very briefly, Barbara and Farhad.
I hear this a lot, that people say we're going to stratify according to what works, and I appreciate that. But I think at a meeting like this, we need to open up the very decisions that we've already made when we say what works. Because one argument against stratification, in the old type of stratification is, and this is very much the tenet of precision medicine, we do away with the old symptom-based disease taxonomies. We don't, sex and race and all of those things, we need to replace those coarse categories with molecular and other characterizations of people in every stage of health and disease. So we're going to be, agnostically, hypothesis-free, looking for what works. But we already made a decision to look at certain things rather than others. And I think this is where we can link to your question, James, and to your question as well. We've already made a decision to look at biophysical characteristics rather than social determinants, for example. So, I would start with, I would like to pose the hypothesis that maybe what works and what has a huge health impact for many people would be the introduction of universal health care in countries where it doesn't exist. The focus of our emphasis on affordable and stable housing, which has huge health impact. So I'm not trying to diss what anyone is doing, but I think at an interdisciplinary meeting like this, we need to really open up and make explicit the decisions we've already made when we bracket off the categories according to which we even characterize and describe what works.
Dr. Brusa, I think everybody wants to go to lunch, so my question, which was on well-being and who decides and how, I think we will rest on that.
I will do briefly to simply pick up on Professor Wilson's point. I hate to disagree with Lee Hood about anything, but I don't think in 10 years everyone will have access to all of this. I think it's more complicated than that. But I'd love to be proved wrong. With regard to equity, with regard to how we even think about the patient, I want to agree with Professor Brainsack as well. The language we use is worth paying attention to. When we talk about patients failing to comply, the failure is placed on the patient rather than the therapy fails to be workable for the patient. When we talk about a cancer patient failing immunotherapy, no, the immunotherapy has failed the patient. And yet we use these words, and I don't cast any aspersion because they're built into our language like this. And when we talk about educating patients, we ought to balance that equally with listening to patients, because we might prove to be the ones who are partly ignorant.